Welcome to the Essentially You podcast. Lara Briden, how are you doing today, girl?
Pretty good, Mariza. Really nice to see you again.
It is so nice to see you. Actually, I had been waiting on bated breath to have this conversation with you. And I know you had to reschedule a couple times. And I'm just like, oh, because I would know early in the week that it was coming. And I'm like, oh, I have an interview with this amazing woman on Thursday. And then all of a sudden I'd look and I'm like, poof, it's gone. And I'm like, she must,
Yeah.
life is busy and things are busy. So today
Yes.
is the day we get to have this
Today is it.
amazing conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
We're talking about healthy hormones in our 40s. And what I'm so excited for this conversation because some women are be like, what hormones in my 40s? I don't even feel no hormones anymore. Like, what's going on in my 40s? And so you have also a new book out that I'm so excited about. We're going to be talking about that too. And you go deeper in this book. So if you're listening to this today and you're hearing some of our conversation and you're just like, I need more hormone literacy. I need to know what's happening. Girl, go get her book. It's on Amazon. You know what I'm saying? Like it's everywhere books are sold. And
Yeah.
soon it's going to be on Audible. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm doing the audio recording. So this is the book. It's Hormone Repair Manual.
Thank you for sharing it.
Yeah, it's on print, obviously. It's
On
on
print.
ebook, and I'm doing my own audio for the audiobook. So hopefully that
I
turns
just
out
want to
well.
take a moment and honor
Yeah.
you for that.
Yeah.
I don't even get offered. They're like, here's your people, choose one of these three women,
Right.
and I really appreciate that because even I do big solo episodes on this show and I curate all that content and like read it.
Yeah.
And ooh, even an hour of reading, I'm sending you so much amazing audible energy as you read your book because I know you're going to rock it, but I know it takes a little bit of time.
It does.
It
Yeah.
does.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Healthy hormones. Tell me, what healthy hormones can we be
Yes.
expecting in our 40s? Because as you love to speak to it, it's our second puberty. And
Yes.
actually, let's go back a little bit because I don't think we realize how long puberty is for us
Yeah.
as when we're little girls. And that
Yeah.
is a journey that so often it's kind of brushed to the wayside. And that
Yeah.
this is kind of the same length, maybe even longer in the transition out.
Yeah, both first and second puberty can last up to about 10 years. And they're quite parallel. So first puberty, we go from the low hormone state of childhood into first estrogen goes up, starts spiking up before progesterone kicks in, before the menstrual cycle has matured enough to ovulate and make progesterone. And that's why girls at that age can get kind of crazy heavy periods and migraines and things kind of flaring up. It can be a challenging time. Often that's temporary. And at the same time, as in my first book, I talk about lots of ways to give support to those girls so they don't have to shut it all down by going on the pill, for example. But first puberty is this process of maturation of the reproductive cycle, the menstrual cycle. And then we're in that for a good, 3.5 decades, kind of 30 or 40 years. We may or may not have babies, but it should all be happening during those years. And then from about our late 30s or into our 40s, the age is genetic, so it will vary from woman to woman. But as early as our late 30s, we enter perimenopause or second puberty. And that is the reverse sequence of events. So first, progesterone drops away. Progesterone is the precious hormone that it's so hard to make. Progesterone drops away, starts to drop away, and estrogen starts to spike up to 3 times what it was during our reproductive years, at times, up and down, up and down. And then eventually we move into a lower estrogen state, kind of similar to the childhood state. And that whole process can take anywhere between kind of 7 to 10 years. And people might experience symptoms for anywhere from 2 to 10 years. It's spread over 4 phases, which I talk about in the new book about, phase 1, when periods are still regular, but you're starting to notice symptoms. Phase 2, into phase 4, which is what I call the waiting room. It's where I am now, wondering, was that period 6 months ago my last period or not? And and then if once you pass that 12 months, then you achieve or graduate to menopause. And menopause can be a much calmer place. So if there are going to be symptoms during second puberty, it's all during these years in our 40s, which is one of the messages as you may know from my book and on social media, I'm trying to explain, to alert women that symptoms could start a lot earlier than you think. Like a lot of people tend to think, oh, menopause is often went into my 50s or 60s. I'm like, it's not in your 60s. Believe me, it's much earlier than that. It's in your 40s. And it's not about aging, really. It's about this transition. So
I agree
yeah.
100%. And I'm so glad
Yeah.
you've given us so much clarity across the
Yeah.
board in terms of when it could start and then when it ends. And then, yes, I think a lot of us have been told that it's menopause, that 12 moment, defining moment, that's where things hit the fan. And we just got the messages completely confused and wrong. And no wonder women at 58 or 62 are coming to you and are like, menopause, is this menopause, like what's going on with me?
Right.
And you're like, okay, no, that was, you're not in that anymore.
No.
A quick question I want to ask you, because I've been asking a lot of my experts how.
Sure.
So once you hit menopause, I know you're in the waiting room right now, and you hit menopause, it's 12 months, no period. Waha, we're here.
Yeah.
And do you just call it menopause from there on out, or do you have other languaging after that? Okay, I do too. You and I are very aligned on that, and so I'm glad. Okay. There's a lot of different like post-menopause and da, 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 da. So I just am like, you're there and you're just you get to cruise in there, in that beautiful phase in your life.
Yeah, so I use the definitions of Professor Geraldine Pryor, who helped me with this book. She's an endocrinology professor. She says perimenopause is the transition, including the 1 to however many years after the final period until you achieve menopause. And then menopause is the life phase that begins 1 year after the final period. So it's the next 30 to 40 years. Yes. It's a big chunk of our life, actually.
It is. Yes. And I agree with her and agree with you. That's how I love to define. I feel like postmenopause is just a redundant term, and it feels older. You know what I'm saying? And if we were attributing languaging around how we're, our life phases. Anyway, it was just a quick question I wanted to ask. I was just curious where you stood on that. I felt like I knew it. Yeah. Okay. So we got the landscape of what is happening with progesterone and then estrogen and how they shift into those 4 phases. But let's talk about healthy hormones, because I think a lot of women, this decline has been shared as if that it's a decline in age too. I feel like there's a lot of not my favorite languaging around the decline of these hormones. And it makes it sound like so many women come to me and they're like, I have no progesterone, I have no estrogen, or my estrogen's all over the place. And it sounds like so often I think women feel like that's not normal. That's not supposed to happen. And so I would love for you to kind of dive into, how should what should we experience when our hormones are going through this, or when they're kind of health wise going through this transition? Or is it just a hot mess? Like it just doesn't.
Okay, there's so much there. I'm trying to think how to approach this. So in my book, I talk about how menopause evolved. People can sort of look at that section. It's because I'm an evolutionary biologist by training originally, so I see a lot of things through that lens. It is not just an accident of living too long. There's several lines of evidence that for as long as we've been human, which is a couple 100,000 years, there's been menopause. And then women in their 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, even in ancient people, were beneficial to the group. So there's kind of this argument, like the science suggests that it's no accident, that are physiologically and for the purposes of, passing on our genes and as an adaptation, we stop reproducing at around 45, 50. We stop making our own babies then, and we shift into gear of basically looking after everyone else, all our relatives, grandchildren, if you have grandchildren. Yeah, which doesn't matter. I mean, I had a comment on Twitter saying, well, this grandmother hypothesis of menopause, what does that mean for those of us who haven't had children? Well, I'm one of those. I don't have grandchildren, and I'm never going to have grandchildren, but I still find it very profound to understand that this whole process is taking place because of all the generations, thousands of generations of grandmothers who were in their prime, really. In what we know from modern day forager people, people living traditional lifestyles, women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s gather more food, get more stuff done than any other demographics.
Yeah,
So
they were the ones who led people to the next, to the food, to the water, to the
yeah,
next place that the families in the whole community were going to survive and thrive.
yeah,
These were the
yes,
women, these were who we turned to.
for sure. So it's a very valuable phase of life. We're doing it, our body's doing it intentionally. So just this is all to kind of take away from this narrative that
Or myth
this
that
myth
we didn't
that,
live.
yeah, once our ovaries move it, switch in intentionally switch into menopause, then it's because we're unhealthy or we're old or life is over. It's none of that at all. The way I see it now, in my book, you would have seen I have a section of the book called Return to Girlhood. I've got this through my biology lens and clinician lens. I've kind of got this new view that the basic female physiology is non-reproductive. Like we're children, and then we're reproductive in our reproductive years for 30 or 40 years. That's a very special time. But then we revert back to kind of our baseline female physiology, which is a low hormone state. So there's pros and cons to that. I think, again, one of the narratives is that as soon as we lose estrogen, our health declines. I would challenge that. I think there can be issues with losing estrogen, especially in the context of our modern world. And we can talk about that a little bit, and especially in the context of insulin resistance, which we'll talk about. But for our ancestors who didn't have insulin resistance, I think the shift to lower estrogen was not a big deal for them. So just to say again, I sort of now from the other side of it, I look back at 30 to 40 years of menstrual cycles and making lots of estrogen and progesterone. That was a very special time, but it had to end. It's not meant to last forever.
When I think we have evidence with other cultures, even in our modern world, maybe they're not living the modern craze. They're not living the crazy modern lifestyle that many of us have adopted. And that the decline in estrogen and progesterone really isn't that big of a deal. That they don't even have a word for it.
Yeah, women in traditional societies or living a traditional lifestyle today they know about menopause. They know you stop having babies and stop having periods, stop having babies, but they generally view it as a good thing. It's not a condition. They don't associate any symptoms with it. It's very much in our culture that we have sort of medicalized it. And I say that at the same time, acknowledging that symptoms can be real.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not can be. I mean, they are very real for some women, definitely very real. Some of that is from the phrase is like evolutionary mismatch, like our physiology not fitting well with our modern environment in lots of different ways, which is no fault of women, right? It's not your women's fault that we're exposed to environmental toxins, that we live in a food environment that is very unhealthy to kind of the microbiome and insulin sensitivity and hormonal health in general, that our circadian rhythm is affected by all the nighttime light that we're exposed to, that we don't move as much because we have to sit inside at a desk, and all these things conspire to potentially make what should have been quite an easy transition into a time of symptoms.
I so appreciate the clarification. I appreciate the history. There are definitely, how we've medicalized this, and also myths around, women weren't surviving. They weren't getting to menopause. And I was like, that is just not true either.
That's not true.
And so I wanted to just speak into, but that is the kind of what we're leveraging as a reason for hormone therapy. Is that, well, we died before we ran out of these hormones. So now that we're living this long, we absolutely need these hormones to continue.
So I agree with you. I think part of it's a marketing strategy. Now, just right at this point in the interview, I will say to everyone listening, I'm generally in favor of hormone therapy. So I'm not in the book, you'll see, I talk a lot about when different hormone therapies can be helpful. Estrogen, but also real progesterone or body identical progesterone can be helpful. So it's possible to have this conversation about how, menopause is not new, that traditionally it was not associated with symptoms, that there are various reasons why it might create symptoms now, perimenopause, not menopause, but the transition perimenopause, and that there's no reason inherently we can never say that all women should take estrogen because menopause is not natural. That's not an accurate thing to say, which is exactly the myth you're debunking.
Right.
But at the same time, we can acknowledge that taking hormones can be helpful.
Yes,
So
absolutely. So I wanted to debunk the myth that the marketing
Yep.
ploy around
Yes.
like hormones are going to fix your
Yes.
everything, and this is a condition you're in, and all the all the things, all the stuff that's been wrapped into
Yep.
this. And you and I have had really incredible productive conversations, particularly around progesterone and
Yeah.
how beneficial that can be in perimenopause, and then even where estrogen can come in and be favorable as well. Again, I know that you go through this a lot more in detail in the book too, where it's more when it's favorable, when we should look at history and family history, health history, and then also, what is the duration where we feel very safe recommending these. Everybody's different, but as we get older, maybe they are counterintuitive at times for some women.
Yeah. Well, one of the main things to understand is there's a window. What do they call it?
I call it the estrogen window.
Window of opportunity. I sort of
Yes.
lost the word that I used in the book, but when taking estrogen can be helpful,
Mhm.
more than if it's 10 or more years after the final period, the advice is really not to commence estrogen at that time. If you're still on estrogen, that may be okay, but like not to start estrogen
At
too
60.
much after menopause, because that's when it can be dangerous. So let's just touch on progesterone.
Yeah,
I know
let's
we've
do
talked
that.
about it before. I think we have a previous podcast, or on your summit, we talked about it. You can direct people to our previous conversations as well. But today, just as review, when we say progesterone, we're talking about real progesterone, not progestins. And one of the main messages of a lot of my work, both books and my blog posts, and is to really make that clear that progestins, contraceptive drugs, classic progestins used as part of older types of hormone therapy, are different from progesterone. Mm-hmm. And real progesterone, which you can now get as part of traditional hormone or part of conventional hormone therapy, as in the form of Prometrium in the US, it's called Utrogestin, and the brand name is Utrogestin in other parts of the world, is body identical or natural progesterone. It's exactly identical to human progesterone, which is so much safer for the breasts and for the brain usually. And so that's just an important takeaway at this point in our conversation, I think.
Absolutely. And where I know you have found it to be extremely helpful, I know this is where I have found it to be extremely helpful, is really towards that phase 3, potentially phase 2, phase 3 of perimenopause. Yes. That's where the decline really hurts.
It's true. That's where progesterone was wavering in phase 1, and then in phase 2 and 3 it just conks out. Yeah.
Yes. And what are some of the benefits? I think mood support is where it shows up for. It's a stress protective hormone, so it helps us kind of modulate a lot of the modern lifestyle that we're dealing with. I think also it can be very calming for kind of shutting down the mental chatter. Clearly, there's a lot of benefits for progesterone, but I feel like that's a lot of what women can kind of be experiencing during phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3, kind of 42 to let's say 50, kind of, again, everyone's different.
For sure. So the 3 main kind of therapeutic times in the book, when I talk about using progesterone alone, would be migraine prevention.
Yes.
Perimenopausal insomnia, and heavy periods. Heavy periods, almost regardless of the cause. So adenomyosis, or just the most common cause of heavy periods in perimenopause is the shift to anovulation, the shift to anovulatory cycles, or cycles when you make lots of estrogen but no progesterone. Because progesterone normally has the effect of lightening flow, of thinning uterine lining and preventing heavy periods.
So what could be happening
at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. So what could be happening is your pituitary gland is sending messages to the ovary saying, hey, let's keep making these eggs. And this is my layman's terms of it, describing it. And your ovaries are like, I'm good this month. Let me double up next month though. I'll make up for it. And then we end up getting this really, really heavy period. And it doesn't feel like a lot of fun.
For sure. Yeah. So because the ovarian follicles are not as responsive. So they're they're on their way, which is how they make a lot of estrogen. But then they're like, I can't cross the finish line to making a to ovulating and making, just can't get there. And just to say again, this is a normal
Yes.
part of perimenopause. It's really not a sign that you're aging too quickly or that something's wrong or that your ovaries are failing. It's just, this is, at this age, the ovarian follicles are just
They're
dialing
slowing
down
down.
their ability. Their ability to cross that finish line. They're slowing down in some ways, but they're unfortunately pumping out lots
They're
of
pumping,
estrogen,
yeah, because they're trying to meet the
try to do
demand
it,
of the brain, who's like, keep
Yeah.
it going. Yeah, there's this,
It's
it's like a very heavy discussion between the
Yeah.
ovaries. And
That's a nice analogy. Yeah. Professor Pryor, the endocrinologist who helped me with my book, calls it a grand finale or the fireworks show in the ovaries. They're trying to do what they were supposed to be doing, and they're just basically just making lots of estrogen and almost no progesterone.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And that's the heavy bleeding. So, okay, so those are the
Yeah.
three. Yes, those are the three kind of identifying places. And I would
Yeah.
say that majority of women, at least that I connect with, these are things
Yeah.
that these are absolutely things that they're dealing with. The migraines, the heavy bleeding, those are, and they're just, and they feel disruptive.
I'm going to mention the hormonal IUD because I may have mentioned it to your audience before. I'm not sure, but it's worth mentioning because a lot of women will be turning to that for heavy periods.
Or recommended the pill, just the pill. Yeah.
Well, the pill. Yeah. I would argue, well, obviously I would argue that there are ways to do this and address symptoms without contraceptive drugs of any form. Then in the book, I also talk about the fact that if you're going to take any contraceptive drugs or progestins, then the hormonal IUD is arguably a more logical one to do because it works locally in the uterus. It doesn't suppress ovulation always, although it sometimes does.
Mm-hmm.
So you can still cycle, get the benefits of your natural menstrual cycle, which is still beneficial in our 40s. It's not like when you're done having babies, you don't need your menstrual cycle anymore. In the book, I make the case that you should, it's called cycle while you can, kind of keep it going as long as you can. And the hormonal IUD can permit that. Just to be clear, there's no progesterone in the hormonal IUD, despite the fact that it's sometimes called that. That's a drug called levonorgestrel, which lightens flow. As a final just comment about the hormonal IUD and progesterone, it is possible to use both the hormonal IUD and to take progesterone as well to help with migraine prevention or sleep. So it doesn't have to be an either or situation. I get asked that question a lot, and I do say it in the book, but only like in one sentence. So I'm just trying to put it out there too, that's a possibility. Yeah.
I'm just going to paint the picture really quickly for kind of explaining all that. One, that you and I are in agreement that it is possible to manage those symptoms that we mentioned, especially with the increase in estrogen, without hormone therapy or without synthetic hormone therapy or without being on the pill or even an IUD. However, if symptoms get worse and you have exhausted these other options that we talk about a lot on social media or in our podcast or inside the books, then the next step when it comes to the least invasive option, even of hormonal synthetic hormones, is the IUD. Then if that for some reason doesn't handle business, then you can step into taking the pill, which is more systemic. It's systemic. It's not just local. Before maybe you move into other, we're talking about heavy bleeding, maybe it's fibroids. I don't, depending on what's going on, then it keeps on scaling up to more invasive.
Yeah, I would say amongst my patients, and it should never reach the level of needing the pill. Like that would be very unusual. Again, just to quote her, like she's pretty clear that perimenopause is not a time to take the pill. But no, agree. So we're totally on the same page, and that's good clarity to give everyone.
And I just mean if they're just like pill or hysterectomy or pill or like, I'm just, sometimes things get really drastic, and these are the, you should advocate. Hopefully we're educating you to advocate for the least invasive option. And you're saying, this is what I want. Cause they may not even offer an IUD, but you may just say, hey, could I get an IUD instead? And so,
for sure.
Yeah. So I was just giving clarity in so many of the conversations that I've heard from patients and readers of like, these were my options. And I'm like, okay, let's talk a little bit about estrogen. I know that, she tends to be the star of the show. I call her the Beyonce of the hormones.
The Beyonce. I like that. That's good. Yeah.
And sometimes there's a really beautiful light put on her. Other times she's villainized. and what I really love in this conversation is just the facts are the facts. Estrogen is going to increase due to the wind down of our ovaries, right? And I love the grand finale, the big fireworks show. As the 4th of July is about to happen here in the States, that feels very appropriate. And so, managing that, I really feel that's where so much of the discomfort comes from, is when we're dealing with a lot of flooding of estrogen. What are some of your recommendations around kind of supporting estrogen during this transition?
In the book, I talk a lot about the intersection, how estrogen interacts with the immune system and creates this mast cell or histamine response, which then in turn creates more estrogen. Unfortunately, it actually stimulates the ovaries to make more estrogen. So one of the interventions I will do is to try to calm down a histamine or mast cell response, kind of an inflammatory immune response. If that's happening, that usually looks like dairy-free. So I do talk about quite a bit about, I don't think every single woman needs to be dairy-free, but I think at least probably 1 in 3 women with, heavy periods or symptoms of this, maybe headaches, kind of fluid retention, rashes, that kind of thing, breast pain can be associated with high histamine. And then in that case, in my book and with my patients, I direct them to different types of dairy. So maybe stopping normal cow's dairy, you can still have butter, you can still have goat or sheep cheese, you can have something called A2 dairy if you can access it there. So that's one of my favorite recommendations. I also in the book talk about iodine, which has an anti-estrogen effect, basically. Probably one of my favorite prescriptions, although you do have to be careful with iodine.
Yes, you do.
Please, I direct people I've written about the safety, my thoughts about safety about iodine. I've written about that in both books, on my blog. So just be careful. Do not just go out and buy some iodine off the internet and start taking a big dose, because some of the doses out there are huge, and too much iodine can harm your thyroid, but the right amount for you can lighten periods, help with adenomyosis, eliminate breast pain, which can be quite helpful. I also in the book talk about, with regards high estrogen, the role of the gut in clearing estrogen. I think a lot of people are starting to understand this.
Yes,
I'm sure you've written about it and
we talk about it a lot. The estrobolin, pooping, girl. We talk about pooping. Yes, moving it out. I say use it and lose it is kind of my mindset around estrogen.
It's true. That's how estrogen exits the body. And so there are lots of ways to support that. Having a healthy microbiome is a big part of that. Moving your bowels regularly, absolutely. The other thing that can support that healthy detoxification of estrogen is, now we come to a sad topic, is no alcohol.
Real talk. Yes. Can we just highlight that for just a second? Please, by all means, riff on the no alcohol piece.
Alcohol does lots of bad things to us, especially during perimenopause or second puberty. One of the things is that it impairs the healthy detoxification or clearance of estrogen quite profoundly. Alcohol also causes intestinal permeability, which is another, creates inflammation in the body. Probably your listeners are familiar with that concept, leaky gut or intestinal permeability. Alcohol is just generally not good for the brain. And actually, sorry, just cycling back to the way estrogen increases estrogen, alcohol increases estrogen, that translates into a breast cancer risk. So here's an interesting statistic that I am trying to get out there. Moderate alcohol intake, like even just a few drinks in a week, increases the risk of breast cancer as much or more than estrogen therapy. So again, not to say that everyone needs to take estrogen therapy, but just to kind of position those two risks. And a lot of women are quite frightened of estrogen, but alcohol is in that same territory. So that would be an argument for seriously reducing alcohol or quitting it, which is what I actually recommend during these second puberty years, because now going back to the brain, the way alcohol affects the brain, second puberty or perimenopause is a neurological transition primarily. It affects lots of things, insulin metabolism, which we might get to. It affects, heavy periods. It affects lots of things, but the center of it is the way the brain changes. I have a chapter called Rewiring the Brain, Recalibration of the Brain during perimenopause, and alcohol makes that a lot harder. So removing alcohol can improve sleep quite dramatically. It can sometimes be one of the only things you have to do to get rid of hot flashes and night sweats. Yeah. So I know I know there are at least a few people listening going, I don't want to hear that. That's not what I want to hear, but it's just really important message. And now with our conversation, we're hopefully trying to counteract a lot of the unfortunate messaging out there about wine for women and how women, how these images of women drinking wine, and that's how you relax and it's how you get through menopause. And I just find that so sad and so concerning that those images are out there, because wine is not helping us, or
No,
wine or any
wine is
alcohol.
not. It's
No.
damaging. And I think, if anyone listening and they're bristling up and they're just
Yeah.
like, don't you dare
Yeah.
take my wine. I just want you to I just want you to tap in to the next morning. Tap into how you
Yeah.
feel the next morning, and be really, really honest with yourself about
Yeah.
how, are you feeling sluggish, low energy, brain fogged, irritable? Is your digestion not feeling 100%? Are you not able to focus as well that day? These are
Yeah.
the things that you should be looking out for. It doesn't have to feel like a hangover. It just has
Yeah.
to feel like blah. And
For sure.
that's alcohol affecting your ability to function, and
For
the hot
sure.
flashes and all the other things. And it's
Yeah.
driving insulin resistance. I mean, there's all kinds of other things
Yeah.
behind the scenes that may not be as obvious.
For sure. Yeah. No, yeah. So I hope people are inspired to at least kind of revisit it and break up with it. Break up with alcohol if you need to, if it's that kind of not a good friend, a toxic friend, basically.
Yeah. And even give it 30 days. Just give it 30
Yeah.
days, maybe just
Yeah.
devote a month to no alcohol and see how you feel,
Sure.
and I think that's usually so often, like, if we can take a chunk of time off, especially if as women,
Yeah.
and feel how we feel without that substance, I think it's like, it literally will feel like night and day.
It's true.
Mm.
No, good.
Yes. Well, okay.
Good.
Check
Yeah.
that one
Yeah.
off the list. Okay.
Yeah.
I want to segue into, any other recommendations for estrogen? So making sure the detox pathways are working clearly.
Yeah. Phytonutrients and like enough healthy prebiotics or fiber in the gut. There's a supplement called calcium D-glucarate, which I prescribe a lot to my patients, which helps with healthy estrogen clearance or detoxification. There's lots you can do. Yeah.
Oh, love it. Love it. Love it. Love your liver. Love your liver.
Yes.
I always just, love
It's
it.
true.
And don't love it with wine.
Yeah.
Okay. Then I want to segue in to
Yeah.
insulin resistance.
Yes.
Insulin she's over here, and
Yeah.
we are not paying close enough attention to her. I think the modern medical system, at least what I've observed, is we are very much on the watch and wait train, and we're watching and waiting, and we maybe we're not even looking at insulin resistance at all. Then we start to see you crawling into prediabetes. And then, and we say, watch and wait, watch and wait, watch and wait. And then bam, you've got, you've got type 2 diabetes. This is the worst case scenario of this situation. But there's a lot of symptomology. There's a lot of not feeling great, even when we just have insulin resistance.
It's very central to the perimenopause story. So as you would have seen in Hormone Repair Manual, I just talk about it again and again and again. So one of the things to say about it, I've just talked about how the brain has to recalibrate or rewire. It's like a software update that happens with the brain. It's pretty crucial, actually, because if the brain can't do this update recalibration successfully, what the research shows, unfortunately, is the brain is kind of going down the road to dementia a couple decades later. So the stakes are high. This is not just about feeling better, not having night sweats or hot flashes. This is actually about your brain health for the next few decades. And insulin resistance plays a role because I'll try to say this as carefully as I can. In phase 4 of perimenopause, when estrogen finally drops, all cells in the body, including in the brain, lose some of their ability to turn glucose into energy. So we get this up to 25% in drop in brain energy, which is crazy. This is what they're seeing on the brain scans. This is why the example I give in the book, I forgot where I parked my car, one time. It's, we start mixing up words. And this does happen to all women to some extent, but then it should be temporary as the brain recalibrates to being able to use ketones for energy more of the time. It's about having metabolic flexibility to do that. And then if the cells can do that, if the brain can do that, it comes out the other side in this new kind of efficient mode of using ketones, which means tapping into the body fat stores to get the energy it needs. If the brain can't make that transition, I guess the brain and everywhere in the body can't make that sort of transition to having more metabolic flexibility and not being as reliant on estrogen for glucose burning, then long-term health problems can come. And the number one thing that interferes with this transition to metabolic flexibility is insulin resistance, if that makes sense. Insulin resistance, that level of kind of metabolic dysfunction, if that's present, it makes it really hard for the brain recalibration, for the metabolism recalibration. And it's, I think, where a lot of the symptoms come from, actually.
Yes.
So I make the case that having insulin resistance makes perimenopausal symptoms worse, particularly hot flashes and night sweats. And at the same time, the final phase of perimenopause promotes insulin resistance. So it becomes a vicious cycle. So, which can be corrected. So it's not like it's all hopeless. But the correction starts by identifying what's going on. And that starts by diagnosing insulin resistance. And the way I diagnose it is with a test for insulin, the hormone insulin. So so everyone is clear, having a normal glucose test from your doctor does not mean you don't have insulin resistance. It cannot rule out your sugar could be normal, but you still have this underlying problem with insulin, or chronically high insulin, or underlying metabolic dysfunction that shows up as chronically high insulin. I know that's kind of technical. I guess at the end of the day, what I would say is get tested for insulin resistance if you can. My preferred test is doing the oral glucose tolerance test with insulin. So not just measuring glucose, but measuring the hormone insulin. So measuring it fasting, and then you have the sugar drink, and then you measure it at 1 and 2 hours. If you can't access that test, then at least a fasting insulin can be helpful. So I have in the book sections about how to talk to your doctor. So you can look at those, how to talk to your doctor about insulin resistance. I'll talk about some of the signs and symptoms of insulin resistance, which is
let's
weight gain
talk
around
about
the
it.
middle.
Because let's just, and the testing, I think testing is so critical, and don't guess if you can, but I know a recent study that I had read is that at least in the US that 88% of adults have some level of metabolic dysfunction. That leaves only 12% of us who don't. And so I would say that it's safe to say that, with our protective hormones dropping, and that we're already becoming just like even pregnancy, right? We become more naturally insulin resistant during pregnancy. And hence, and we're looking at that, I remember, I think we talked about this when I had my fasting glucose test, and I was just told I was going to fail it. Like she's like, this is how old you are, and this is pregnant, and you're going to fail. Like I don't see women at 40 and older, even late 30s, who don't fail this test. And I just want to, and I know people have heard me say this, but I passed it. So, and so because I had been dialing in my metabolic health for so long. But so let's talk about some of those symptoms, and let's just say safely that this is just something we should all be mindful of. And we should be taking lifestyle, we should be pivoting lifestyle to know that our brain is making this massive shift, and we should give it all the support it needs to make that transition as easy as possible.
For sure. All of us with menopause, with the arrival, that phase 4 of perimenopause and menopause, all of us do shift in the direction of insulin resistance. Some of us may not go all, you may or may not be all fully
12% of us,
but you're shifting in that direction. So so symptoms, abdominal weight gain, that classic kind of apple-shaped weight gain. The other ones I typically flag are high triglycerides on a blood test, fatty liver. is usually, fatty liver can be caused by other things, but if your doctor has mentioned fatty liver because of a blood test or an ultrasound, then that's often downstream from insulin resistance. You get something called skin tags, which if anyone who has them, they know what they are, these little skin tags.
Or even dark, like that dark kind of
ankylosing. There's this kind of darkening of the skin on the neck and under the arms. And yeah, so those are some of the kind of giveaways that insulin resistance is happening. Oh, a history of gestational diabetes, a history of PCOS, a family history of type 2 diabetes, because there is a genetic component. It's not fair, but some women just tend more to it. It's just a sad reality, basically. Some people are genetically sheltered from it. It's kind of the luck of the draw, unfortunately, that way. But it's actually, the way to see it is actually people who are genetically prone to insulin resistance are descendants of people who were survivors, like awesome at surviving kind of famine, and were able to keep going, keep reproducing, even when there was low food intake, which made for a hard life. Genes that help them to do that are in an evolutionary mismatch with our modern world. If that makes
they're not serving us today like they were back in the
day. They're not helping today, unfortunately. Yeah.
I'm one of those people. So my people survived. And now I'm one of those people.
Yeah.
I have a predisposition to type 2 diabetes. And so, and the sooner we know these things, I think it's important too as well. But yeah, I mean, I love the symptomology. I think other symptoms that I see too are like cravings and brain fog. And, those are way much more earlier kind of symptoms. But I think the big thing is the weight resistance and the belly fat is where I find that women are like, what is going on? Yeah. Okay. So, and we know, as you mentioned, estrogen goes and a major layer of protection goes away as well. And that's naturally going to happen. So Lara, honey, how do you set us up for success? How do we begin to pivot? And could we start pivoting in our mid-30s? Could we start thinking about that then?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's all about building resilience in the nervous system, in metabolism, metabolic flexibility. That would be in the general maintenance chapter of my book, where it's, having all the things, right, that we talk about all the time. So healthy gut, healthy circadian rhythm, healthy nervous system, reducing stress, cutting alcohol, taking magnesium. That's, my kind of one recommendation. I'm kind of like, if you take one supplement, let it be magnesium. Except there's very few situations when maybe you need to talk to your pharmacist or doctor about whether magnesium is safe for you, but it is safe for most people. Yeah, and get sleep and move outside and all these things. And then you might find after even hearing all the horror stories about perimenopause, you may get into it and actually find you're fine. Maybe movement, building muscle is actually quite important for maintaining insulin sensitivity.
We want that muscle mass. We start to decline that too.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, and then depending on how it's all going, potentially looking at herbal medicines and different supplements I talk about in the book, and potentially, depending what you're needing, there is the option of hormone therapy, either in the form of kind of progesterone alone, or in the phase 4 of perimenopause and a little bit beyond, an estrogen in a patch form. I'll say kind of in closing, like if you're going to take estrogen therapy, and it's understandable if you have reached that point where you need it, it's so much safer taking the patch or a gel, like transdermally through the skin, rather than the old style kind of oral pills in general. And in the book, I list all the different brand names of different hormone therapies and kind of what they contain and what they are. So,
love it. I think you've given us such a beautiful kind of way of looking at this transition, and a way to just see it in a really positive light, but then also just have awareness and then be able to begin to implement, because I think there's a lot of things, as you and I both know, our bodies are changing. Like you said, second puberty, we're in that parallel, we're declining, but that doesn't mean declining cellular age. That doesn't necessarily,
we're not declining, our hormones are changing.
So, it doesn't mean that we're declining.
Oh,
but that we can make these beautiful pivots, and we can make these changes
yeah.
knowing that our body is changing, and we get to change along with it. And that's the message I've always loved that you have brought to the forefront is,
Mhm.
here's the reality of these changes. And, here is how we can set ourselves up for success. But
Yeah.
what these changes are not is us. This is not synonymous as of just aging. This is not aging at all. These are just a shift in how this was always the plan.
Exactly. I love your phrasing. That's beautiful. Yeah.
I love that. Now we want to go check you out. One, we want to go get the book. And I know that you
Yeah.
have a gift, which is I don't know if it's the first two chapters or if
Yeah.
it's, yes.
The
Okay.
first two, the introduction and the first two chapters of my new book, Hormone Repair Manual. So that's available to everyone who listened today. I think that you'll
Yay.
get be sent that link. Yeah, and thanks so much for having me. I always love chatting with you. I know, of course, you have a book about perimenopause as well. So I mean, I'm sure all your followers already know that. I'm gonna check it out. I haven't had a chance to see it yet, but I'm very
Yeah, we
keen
need to
to.
get you a
I have to
copy. We
say,
need to send you one.
yeah,
And we will
yeah,
do that. And then also
yeah.
go to laurabriden.com. That's the best place. Your blog is phenomenal. I mean, she
Mhm.
just does the book is everything. Get the book.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
the blogs, that they're little, they're like really amazing little tasters of what you're
yeah,
going to get in the book. And then
sure.
you are on social media, maybe not as active as you used to be, but you are very much on
Yeah,
social media. And I think you do a phenomenal job there as well. And so
yeah,
please go check out Laura, especially if you were loving
yeah.
this conversation. And it's just felt more like the kind of conversation you want to be having. This is what she does every day.
Thanks so much. Yeah, but thanks again, everyone, for listening.
Thank you so much for coming on, my dear. I'm so grateful that we got to have this conversation today.